Hello everyone, and welcome to the Darkest Hour. I'm your host, Amanda Jane. In a world teeming with billions of souls, has the notion of a 1 in a million chance lost its luster? What was once considered rare or improbable has now become an unsettling commonality for countless individuals across the globe. Tonight, we delve into the unsettling stories that emerge from these once extraordinary odds. Through the lens of traumatizing experiences, we discover tales that sometimes defy logic and challenge our understanding of life as we know it. These are the types of stories that demand to be heard and deserve to be shared. They hold within them the power to captivate, terrify, and undoubtedly provoke profound contemplation. So, let's get started, shall we? My best friend Renee in the 4th grade didn't have what you'd call a good home life. Her mom and dad were always at the bar, so we had full reign over her house the majority of the time. As 4th graders, we weren't having big parties yet, but we were watching movies we shouldn't have been and eating entirely too many sweets for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Then something freaky happened that made me never stay the night there again. It was just after midnight and we're in Renee's living room watching a movie. I was lounging on the couch with the ottoman while Renee was laying on the long sofa. I'm getting pretty sleepy and starting to doze off, my head resting on the arm of the couch, and out of the corner of my eye, I see Renee do a weird whole body jitter on the sofa, like she had a bug on her or something. So I turn my head and actually look in her direction. As I do, I see her body roll off the sofa onto the floor. She didn't put up her hands to brace herself and smacked her head on the edge of the coffee table going down. At first, I just looked at her, waiting to see if she was joking. But I knew, joking or not, that meeting with the coffee table was not planned. Then she starts convulsing. That's when I got up and ran over to her. I got on my knees and rolled her onto her back. The expression on her face was terrifying. Blood was trickling from the wound on her forehead, and her eyes were rolled back to their whites. Seeing all of this made me quickly diagnose. That's a big cut. That's a lot of blood. Is what she's having a seizure? Being in 4th grade, the only other time I'd seen anything about seizures, it was diabetes. Renee didn't have one of those medical bracelets, and I was about to start running through the house, trying to find one of those big EpiPens to stab her with. And then I thought, no, let's call 911. The house phone's located on the side table next to the couch that I was on, but when I turned from Renee and tried to get up, her hand grabbed the back of my ankle. Her grip pulled me back down to my knees. I turned to look at her. She's now sitting straight up. Then she turns to look at me, but her back remained stiff as a board. Her head rotated slowly to face me, and with her eyes still rolled in the back of her head, I was paralyzed with fear. I started hysterically screaming at her to let go of my leg. Her nails were digging into my skin, and the pain felt like teeth tearing at the back of my ankle. I tried kicking her hand off my leg, but her strength wouldn't even let me lift it off the ground. Renee's nose starts to bleed a steady stream down her chin and onto her shirt. I'm looking at her, and I can see that her lips are moving, so I stop screaming to hear what she's saying. Mind you, her eyes still haven't left the back of her skull, but what she starts saying was by far the most disturbing part of any of this. I was terrified beyond belief, but up until this point, I thought this still could have been a seizure she was experiencing. I was more afraid for what we were both going through. But she wasn't shaking anymore, and when she started talking, it was like she was whispering a joke to herself in a really deep voice, then a quiet chuckle. Seeing her giggling to herself while I'm crying my eyes out really upset me. I thought, is she messing with me right now? How did she have this much strength in her hands to maintain such a tight grip? Then she gets louder. What she was saying, it didn't even sound like English. The voice I was hearing, it didn't sound like Renee's voice. I could hear two different tones coming from her speech. Her body didn't move when she exhaled with a final, loud, deep laugh. Then, Renee closes her eyes and falls backwards onto the ground, letting go of my leg. Right when I felt her fingers let go, I pulled my leg back and stretched for the house phone that I previously couldn't get to. While I'm on the phone with 911, Renee's parents get home drunk from the bar, Dawn and Arlette. When they stumble in the door, they're in a fight, yelling back and forth louder than I am on the phone. They either didn't notice or didn't care that someone else was screaming inside their house. They were so focused on each other, Dawn almost kicked Renee in the face as he was stepping around the living room. But when he saw Renee all bloody and stretched out over the floor, he started screaming again and swoops up her limp body off the ground. He hollers for Arlette to call 911. Then he sees me already on the phone. Arlette runs out of the kitchen going, What? While Dawn starts yelling in my direction, asking what happened. Now I'm in a ball on the floor screaming back that I don't know. Dawn tells Arlette they need to take Renee to the emergency room. As Dawn runs back out the front door with Renee in his arms, Arlette is staring daggers at me with squinted eyes. She points her finger at me and says, "What did you do, you little bitch?" She shakes her head at me like she's disappointed, then turns and follows in Dawn's route back to the car. With the front door left wide open, I watch their car back out of the driveway and pull off into the darkness. I was left alone, and that sudden realization took the remaining composure I'd been trying to maintain during the conversation with the 911 operator. They were still on the phone. They heard over the call and still sent an ambulance out to take me to the hospital to get checked out. They called my parents, bandaged up the scratches on my leg. I could hear Renee's parents intoxicated, arguing somewhere further down in the hospital. When my parents came to pick me up, I told them everything and begged them to hide me when we walked through the ER waiting room. But my dad said that I wouldn't have to worry about that. He saw both parents passed out on chairs, snoring by the vending machine. When we did exit, we still made sure to get out fast. And that was it. Renee was back at school on Monday and couldn't remember anything that happened. She acted completely normal. When she invited me over after school, I made an excuse and continued to do that until she eventually stopped asking. I was still nice to her at school, but I think she got the hint. If she really didn't remember anything, even though I don't know how you couldn't, especially having to go to the hospital and stuff, like no memory of anything, and now you're just fine. No, I'm sorry. Renee did turn out normal. We were classmates until she moved during high school. Different friend groups, but she was a normal girl. As it was all happening, I thought to myself, dang, I'm never going to forget this. It's hands down the scariest thing I've ever witnessed. I've met both a serial killer and a couple serial rapists, along with a host of people who have done terrible things one time, such as dismemberment, strangulation, or other crimes. I used to do forensic work where I would meet with people who were either in prison already with psychiatric problems, usually protective custody where they were not to be with other inmates or about to go to court, requiring evaluation for a mental state at the time of the crime, or in long-term psychiatric care via the court. Some also had behavioral issues within the prison system. I guess what's daunting about criminals like these, serial ones or not, is you realize they're just people. They're not special, often not different in any way. You couldn't pick them out of a crowd. I think most of us like to think that we know who the terrible people are, or that we could spot them. Truth is, you usually can't. It's not because they are sophisticated or smart. It's just because they're average people who happen to do things that many people likely just think about. So they blend in. It's not intentional or deceptive blending, as people might think. Not most of the time. It's just because they're actually your average Joe 99% of the time, except for that 1% of the time when they're doing something awful. In my job, they like to try to shock you or relive their crimes, but I've heard enough that I just kind of look at them blankly and we continue along. I was often brought in because these guys, they were all men, liked to brag once it was all said and done, and they particularly liked bragging to a young woman. I was in my late 20s at the time, someone who they thought they could get a response from. It was a fatal flaw for most of them in being evaluated, and they'd tell me all sorts of things they likely shouldn't have. Sure, there are some who have real disorders, but the amount of that is often overhyped in the media. What's worse is that on any given day in the United States, there are estimated to be over 50 active serial killers operating undetected. Watch your back. I've shared this story before, and believe it or not, it was taken humorously. I may not go as far as calling you a bad person for laughing, but I can assure you, it's not a funny story. It's actually a story so traumatic that I can remember odd and every detail, and I was 7 years old when it happened. My bus stop was on a road that makes a super tight L shape. That's where me and the other kids from Deer Lake Elementary waited for the bus to pick us up in the morning. The bus stop area was designated by a big boulder on the side of the road in the grass, right at the elbow of the turn. After, it's another long road that branches off to different parts of the town, neighborhoods, and the school. If you go down even further, there's a graveyard at the end of it. A funeral procession was driving by one morning. Me and my friends see the hearse driving at us relatively fast. So all of us hop off the boulder and walk a couple of feet out of the way of the approaching hearse. The thing tries turning too late and hits the boulder head on. It was only going 20 at most, but it was enough to eject the casket out the back of the hearse. When it smacks onto the ground, both its doors pop open, and we get to see the peaceful old man resting in his casket slide past us. Problem is, coming up behind the hearse was the rest of the funeral attendees. First one's a blue Toyota truck with big tires. The guy driving doesn't see what happened from his vantage point. He knows how to take the turn, but he doesn't see the casket. He did feel the truck lift up a little bit on the front passenger side tire as it actually rolls into the open casket. The whole thing made a snap, snap, as the wooden walls at the top of the casket was crushed under the truck, dropping it back down from its tilt. The driver was confused. I think he thought that he hit one of us bus stop kids because he immediately looked out his window at us with a, "Huh?" face. Then he hopped out and walked to the front of his truck and saw his tire inside the casket. flattening the upper half of the body like a pancake. He's like, "Oh no," and jumps back into the truck, throwing it into reverse and hitting the gas with enough torque to shoot the casket forward, out from under the body, spinning it around on concrete until it stopped in an Egyptian-looking pose. That's when me and my friends all went fucking nuts and ran home to our houses. From crash to pose, this whole thing lasted 12, 13 seconds at most, but I don't think I'll ever get the gross, flat-top corpse sliding around out of my core memories. Yuck and sad, really sad for the family. I'm sure they also didn't want that to happen. In 91, I was 6 and living with my father and stepmother. Every other weekend, they would drive me 2 hours to meet my mother at a halfway point for the trade-off. One week, Mom couldn't get off work, and Dad got food poisoning, so my stepmom, Brenda, was left to drive me the whole way. Mom was a waitress, so we timed it to arrive when she'd be getting off at 10, but we never made it. Just past where we normally would have met, we had to get on the interstate. But the on and off ramps weren't like normal ones. The direction they were pointed made them seem backwards to anyone who wasn't used to the area. Lots of accidents happened before they fixed it because so many people would go the wrong way. Just like Brenda. She wasn't familiar with the area at all and turned up the off-ramp. As we came to the final curve, we collided head-on with a huge truck, and an SUV crashed into its rear end. I was in the back seat and briefly knocked unconscious. When I woke, the truck's front tires were through the windshield, and Brenda's head was gone. There was only a fountain of red rushing over the remaining mangled mass below her shoulders. I was trapped inside for almost an hour while the fire department used the jaws of life to pry open the door. I was surrounded by people trying to communicate with me, but I was wholly focused on Brenda. I couldn't have talked even if I had noticed them. I also don't remember screaming, but everyone said I never stopped. I didn't feel pain or realize my legs were trapped under the front passenger seat either, but both were broken in multiple places. They said I didn't notice because of the shock. I didn't have a full grasp on death before the wreck, but I instinctively understood it once I saw what was left of Brenda. I didn't have all the right words for everything, but she was just clearly no more. She was gone. I had to have surgery that night. When I woke, both my parents were there. It was the first time I ever saw my father cry, but there were many more to follow. My parents didn't get back together, but my dad moved 10 minutes away from my mom's house, so he could help with my recovery. When I finally left the hospital, I still had months of physical therapy to endure. The pain is what I remember most. The rest is just a collage of fuzzy memories. Physically, my recovery took about a year. Mentally, well, if you listen to my therapist, it's still a work in progress. But the nightmares mostly stopped in my mid-20s, and surprisingly, talking about it does help. I would always dream about a zombie version of Brenda's head appearing in my lap, staring up at me. Sometimes it was in school. Sometimes it was in the wreck or at the dinner table. Overall, I'm lucky to be alive. Kids riding in the front seat wasn't an uncommon occurrence in those days, and I typically did it all the time. But Brenda, she insisted that I sit in the back. Had I not been in the back, there's no way I would have survived. These days, I'm what you call a granny driver, and proud of it. Up until this moment, I hadn't really experienced a lot of death, but unfortunately, I've killed a man. My boyfriend wanted a steam cleaner, and I wanted to pick up a few things from Walmart. It was around 8 p.m. when I departed. Little did I know, this would be the biggest mistake of my 22 years of living. I arrived at Walmart safely. I picked up the steam cleaner and a few other silly items, home decor, cleaning supplies, etc. After checking out, I headed home. My drive went smoothly, up until I was a block away from home. It was around 9:45 p.m. at this time, and I was literally just thinking, I almost made it home. I was traveling around 35-40 miles an hour. The streetlights are very dim on this road, and at night, you can rarely see what's in front of you. I see a red car parked on the opposite side of the road, but since this road is very scenic during the day, I really didn't think too much of it. And that's when I heard the horrifying thud. Ba-dunk, ba-dunk, ba-dunk. I slammed on my brakes. As soon as I open the door, I hear the blood-curdling screams. A man is running towards my SUV, which I later find out that it's his son. He rips his tank top off. He starts calling me a bitch, informs me that I just killed his dad. His brother followed. I immediately start screaming. I still couldn't see the father. I ran up to the red car, and his two sons start to hug me and inform me, "Ma'am, you didn't do anything wrong. There was a family altercation, and he wanted to die. We called an ambulance for him to get some help." I'm still screaming as they explain this. I come upon his body, sitting in a pool of blood. Within minutes, a policeman pulls up. He immediately starts rendering aid. Minutes later, an ambulance pulls up. I'm still in shock. They started to do CPR before putting his barely alive body in the ambulance. He was life-flighted to a local hospital. It turns out that his body was laying between the two streetlights, and from his chest up was laying in my lane, face down, wearing a black sweatshirt against black pavement. He told his ex-wife, who was at the scene, that he wanted to kill himself because she did not want him back. I wonder why the ex-wife wouldn't put her car in front of the body. I wonder why the two sons couldn't seem to move him from my lane. I wonder why it had to have been me. The man was pronounced dead upon arrival. I'm 22 years old. What could I have done that was so wrong that I deserve to live with that for the rest of my life? I'll never stop replaying the horrifying sound from running the man's body over, the blood-curdling shrieks, the image of the man laying in a pool of his own blood. I don't know if I'll ever be able to live with myself. Death is pretty overwhelming. And I'm not talking about loss. I'm talking about death. My story is about the time I died and they had to bring me back. Now, this probably isn't going to be the same experience as everyone else has had with death. I'm aware that most of what I experienced dead was probably a trick of my mind while trying to save itself. But death was a lot. When the car first hit, I don't remember anything. All I remember from that point is I woke up in a ditch, staring up at the sky, with one eye unable to move, pressed against the ground, and blood dripping down my head. I remember that I heard death. I'd seen dead people before, like most of my grandparents, but I'd never heard it. And what I heard was blood pouring into my dad's lungs. My dad was probably the most capable guy I've ever known. I'd seen him bring a small-town track team to be national finalists multiple times. He gave dozens, I think over 100, of his athletes scholarships by making them better, by helping kids with no opportunities get meetings with scouts and colleges. I'd seen him break the Wamego High School bench press record at 46 to prove a point that his athletes should be working out more. People used to hear his voice from way outside the track stadiums. But what I heard from him wasn't the usual strength in his voice. It was pain, and it was fear. I heard him weakly choke out, "Kade, Kade, Kade." While his organs started filling with blood where it shouldn't be, he kept calling out for me in sheer panic. I called out to him, and we had a short, private, painful conversation that I'll only ever speak to my kids, but the normal stuff was basically the effect of, take care of your mother and survive. I've always loved you. Before blacking out and waking up, being ambulanced to the hospital, I had no idea he was already as good as dead. I was terrified because I hear fear from my dad as he's dying, and I knew it would be coming for me next because, well, the car wreck basically hit at such a fast speed that my seatbelt actually kind of countered the safety because my stomach burst open like if you squeeze a water balloon from one side. Basically, my belly was split. So, I laid in an ambulance as a 13-year-old kid, being kept awake by the people until they could make it to the hospital so I didn't bleed out. The entire time they were talking about Pokemon, telling me to list my favorite types or games or Pokemon. I was thinking, this is it. I always let Dad down, and I'm about to do it again. And I started crying my eyes out in the ambulance out of fear. Fear of death, fear of failure, fear of losing my dad. The ambulance workers helped to perk me up, stay hopeful when they told me my dad had made it to the hospital with me. And this is the part where I died. I was being rushed through the hallways, watching flashing lights that I couldn't see. I saw a kid's dad who I played football with, who was a highway patrolman. I was so out of it, I kept saying, "I'm gonna wake up soon. I just saw my dad's friend." Even knowing what I was going through wasn't some horrific dream, I kept saying it. The last thing I remember normally from this point is being wheeled into the emergency operating room while saying, "Where's my dad? They said he's here. Dad?" Before my normal memory cut off. Because on that operating table, the doctors later informed my family they'd lost me for a short time and had to do everything possible to get me back. It took a lot of therapy, PTSD recollection, repressed memory, recall therapy. It took all that to confront what I felt when I died. Or I think was about the next 2.5 years. I would black out any time I tried thinking too hard about what happened in the room, but eventually, I started having a memory I didn't remember. If you want me to explain what I experienced in single words, I can't. At that moment, what I felt wasn't fear, wasn't relief, wasn't happiness, wasn't pain. I didn't see a lake of fire or a palace in the clouds. What I saw can't be explained using shapes or comparisons or colors or pretty visuals. It felt like everything and nothing was happening to me. But I wasn't scared because the one familiar thing I did see was my dad, or what I felt was my dad. I just felt like for a single moment, my dad and I didn't say anything to each other. We didn't look at each other. We just had a moment where I understood that this was the last moment he and I would ever share. And then he walked off. But I didn't feel the fear from him that I felt before. I think because he knew that I'd be the one who made it. When I woke up next and remember anything, my next memory of the accident, I saw my football coach who had driven in. I told him I'd be a little late to practice. He laughed because I asked where my dad was, because I had no memory of our moment at the time. For the next couple of days, my family kept letting me think my dad was alive and survived because they were worried if I found out the truth, I'd give up while I was still semi-critical. So, 2 days after I died, I was told my dad died, and I spent the next years figuring out what our last connection was. I know this is a long story, but that's because death was long and overwhelming, but it wasn't scary or peaceful or painful. It just made sense. Like when you go lay down after an intense workout and you feel like you belong in that bed. Thanks for reading if anybody did. I just thought I'd put another memorial story out there for my dad. Well, friends, it appears we've reached the end of tonight's episode. Thanks for joining me. Whether it's your first time or you're a regular, your support means the world. We've got brand new episodes every Friday night. Keep those eyes open for those deep sleep videos. And of course, double features. Subscribe, tap the bell, and you'll never miss a thing. Big thanks to those who shared their stories, and a huge shout out to all of my patrons, whom we appreciate so very much. Tracy S, Tamara K, Monica L, ZoeWatt, Chelle B, Donald C, The Dark Cosmos, Marion T, Rat Girl, Alisha S, Erin G, Nikki H, Mr. Revenant, Naz K, Brendon G, Paul T, Nicholas C, Lissane, Arlene F, Adrienne, and TF Parham. If you want to support the Darkest Hour in other ways, consider joining our Patreon. Check out patreon.com/thedarkesthour or click the link in the description to learn more. Do you have stories like these? I'd love to share them. Send them to me, amandadarkesthour@gmail.com, or on the Darkest Hour subreddit, The Darkest Hour YT. Stay spooky.